Today on Up Front, it's all about Winnipeg Harvest, a non-profit community organization serving as a food distribution and training center. It's been around forever, 30 plus years, and today the longtime executive director of Winnipeg Harvest, David Northcott, joins me for a featured chat. David has dedicated a large portion of his life to feeding the hungry. He is revered as a leader, and after a long, successful career, he has decided to retire, where perhaps he will have some time to do this. And now here with the man himself, the Executive Director of Winnipeg Harvest, David Northcott. David, thanks for coming down.
Well, I appreciate inviting me for coffee and a visit at the table here.
Absolutely, excellent. Let's start with the basics here, because I want our viewers to know, when we talk about Winnipeg Harvest, we know it's a food bank, but if people in this city need food, how do they get that food? What's the first step?
I think the first step is recognizing as a family that something's gone wrong this month or this week. Something's gone wrong either in budgeting ability or that you've budgeted everything properly and there's not enough money to go around. That happens way too often to low-income people. So when that takes place, you can do several things. One, a phone call to Winnipeg Harvest. You get our call center and they'll be able to say, here's what's going on. Let's have a chat first with your health card number, etc. And then we identify the person we're talking to, and then we refer them to a food bank in their neighborhood that they can get to. Right. Or if it's a crisis and it's an emergency, they can come down to Winnipeg Harvest right away and pick up a hamper at Winnipeg Harvest. And that's the second way of getting food, is coming right to the food bank, Winnipeg Harvest itself. Right. We can set you up, get you a food hamper, emergency hamper that day, and then we refer you to the food bank in your own neighborhood. We've got about 400 food programs throughout Winnipeg we share food with. Right. So the idea is have food available in the person's neighborhood. And that's been a magic piece for us. That's worked really well. If we did this economically, we would say, here's a bus ticket, come to Winnipeg Harvest, pick up your hamper, and everybody come to Harvest and then go home again. But if we worked on change, the best way to get change is having people in the neighborhood. So we keep food accessible in their own neighborhoods. So that's what happens when somebody gets hungry and gives us a call or walks in the front door.
How big is the food supply for a typical person or family that you give out?
We give people about 5 days worth of food, about 15 meals. Sometimes we give them 10 days worth of food a month because every Manitoban gets some form of income. The argument then, though, is that not all the income is adequate income to be able to let you buy all your food items and still buy all the other items you need in your life. So because of that tension, we're able to give people 5 days, sometimes 10 days worth of food, but we don't let you off the hook. You still have to budget, you still have to manage your life, you still have to make sure you gather food when you need to at superstores or Safeways and Sobeys, all those wonderful retail food stores.
Right. And along with the food, like once these people come in, you try and connect them with other programs as well, like healthcare and housing. Yep. That's a huge part, right? You almost take it upon yourself to get these people to take the next step in their lives.
Absolutely,
right?
Because the sweet spot is we've had this relationship with somebody that says, I'm struggling to feed my children or myself. There's something profoundly broken there, and that there's nobody that goes to the food bank on free will that just loves going. It doesn't happen. When you first make that decision, so in that mix of things, we've got to be able to say, we know what's broken. So if we know what's broken and here's a hamper to get you through the next piece of time, we can help you take some of those next steps after you've eaten. Right. And that's where we look at training, we can look at getting people involved at Winnipeg Harvest, trying to build that self-esteem and that spirit. And once they get that self-esteem and spirit that says, I can help make the next hamper for the next person, then they're in the loop of Winnipeg Harvest. And then they're meaningfully in the loop. It's not made or pretend work, it's real work.
Right.
And from there, we can grow into training programs and get people into jobs.
I want to get to the training programs in a second. In the actual hampers, though, like what are we talking about? Canned foods, of course?
Yes.
What else is in there?
The idea is to try and build it on the basic food groups, the top 10 items that Winnipeg Harvest needs.
You want to be healthy.
We want to be healthy.
Yeah.
Oftentimes people say, oh, that's great, but can I get chocolate? My kids are looking for this. So we often end up sort of doing that, but ideally we don't. But in the basic hamper is 5 days worth of products. So it'd be canned soup, canned meats, canned tuna, that kind of product. We add bread products to it. Then we add something from the freezers that we've got in our freezers that could be frozen meats, that kind of thing that it's available. And then we add something from the fresh produce side. Usually potatoes are spectacular. I'm very generous to that. So we can get them fresh goods, we can get them canned goods, we can get them bread products, and we can get them some frozen goods that will last. And that'll give them probably about, like I say, 5 days worth of food for that family unit.
Right. Your organization has been around for 30 plus years now. It's a big part of the city
Surprising.
and the province,
Yeah.
really. Do you think most people know about Winnipeg Harvest and understand what it is? Like, how do you gauge that awareness level?
I think there's a matrix attached to Winnipeg Harvest and most food banks in Canada. And the first matrix is when you use the word food bank, it interprets one way. It says, you're a bank, you've got food, and I'll get groceries and go home. That's why we didn't call ourselves the food bank in the early days. We wanted to be different. We called ourselves Winnipeg Harvest, and that was Lee Newton's vision at the very beginning. She saw New York Harvest, harvesting surplus food and showing respect to people, making sure that food was shared in that community. So we did the same thing in Winnipeg, Winnipeg Harvest, that came from Lee Newton.
Yeah.
Big thank you to Lee. She passed away now, but big thank you. So from that beginning, we did things differently than anybody else. We made sure we included in the process the person that got the food. We wanted them to come back and help us move the food. And the reason we did that, we chose not to be government funded. From the very beginning times, not government funded or United Way funded. They're good people, but we wanted to be independent of that so we could move quickly and respond quickly and to be able to tell the story well and then eventually back out quickly too, because we no longer were needed in the community. So in those early days, we started very uniquely compared to other food banks in Canada. The Calgary Food Bank is a very strong food program, and that charitable kind of work in Calgary was supported by a way. Each community has unique charitable flavors. So Calgary's flavor was, let's get people jobs, let's get them into work. And so they would say, we'll support a food bank that buys the food, here's your hamper, go away after you can run there for a year or two, and then you got to get a job. And there's jobs usually available. In Winnipeg, it's different. We've got a social justice style community. So they supported a community and a charitable community that deals with social justice. So each community has a unique style of food bank. There's not one cookie cutter that says they're all the same.
Right.
A lot of the bigger food banks are doing things that Winnipeg Harvest is doing, making sure people are actively involved, that clients are as actively involved in the process, not just as getting food, but in helping move food forward.
We're chatting with David Northcott here at Smith Restaurant at the Inn at the Forks here in Winnipeg. This is up front on Shaw TV. Let's switch gears a little bit. Let's take a sip, so to speak, of our coffee
good
and tea.
idea.
Let's do it, or the water. Yeah, let's do water. Let's talk about your family, David. You've got a wife and 3 kids that are all grown up now, I understand.
I blinked and they grew up.
Yeah.
It's just amazing. We moved to Winnipeg many years ago in the late 70s, and then the first couple of years here was really interesting, but I was sort of kicked out of another job, and as the banking world got consolidated and blended together, and I didn't make the blend. So I ended up for 1 year in the inner city, and I said I had a chance to work in that inner city with a friend of mine who introduced me to this 1-year project. The 1-year project was this Broadway Action Steering Committee, and it was really neat in the early 80s. And we were able to get involved and learn about Paulo Freire's book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, looked and learned about chanting and understanding prayer and how do you connect with the community in non-traditional ways. So that first year there, I thought, this is really neat before I go back into the banking world and sort of make my money and raise my kids. So that first year got me started towards this kind of social justice movement. And my first daughter was there, and I had a second and third daughters born in that culture. And it was really kind of neat that as they grew up and they understood things, they grew in those years of Winnipeg Harvest, and they grew in some of the awareness and understanding of hunger and poverty and the way to respond to it. So to this day, they're really neat young women. They're very, very remarkable talents. They don't all live in Winnipeg anymore. Our oldest daughter came back from Vancouver with her husband and 2 grandkids in Winnipeg. It's wonderful. Another daughter and her husband and her daughter live in Montreal, and our third daughter and her husband live in Edinburgh in Scotland. So they've flown and gone free, but they've taken this culture of hunger and poverty relief with them. So that's been kind of neat as a dad.
Yeah, and I know you really adore the city of Winnipeg. What is it about this city that you particularly enjoy?
I love the taste of justice here.
The taste of justice.
Taste of
That's
justice.
Fantastic.
Where it's not just we'll do legally the right thing to do to make sure we have a human right to food, but there's a sense of caring and spirit in this place that says, that's the taste I like. And there's justice that says, let's make it better. It's that harmony that this city does, that we understand good charitable work that's heart-based and spirit-based, and we know that sense of justice world that says we got to make the structural changes so we don't need to be begging for food. I love that harmony in this city. It's very unique that way in Canada, and I really like the taste of that.
So maybe when your kids were younger, what was David Northcott like at the house? How do you relax?
you never had an off button, and it was a lot of stresses of the early days at Harvest, and it's a stressful place. There's things moving. There's no guaranteed money. I've laid myself off 3 times, 4 times now over the years to make sure I could meet payroll. So that's the sort of stress level. And then a very young family. It was joyous coming back to 3 kids. Mm-hmm. It was absolutely joyous. And then they got to become teenagers, and the joy became, boy, this is hard work. They've all got this sense of independent spirit. I don't know where that came from, but they've got that sense of, let's move it forward. I'm going to do it my way, and all that kind of great stuff. And then they turned 20, and life got really good again. Mm-hmm. So I just sort of ran through that kind of stuff and struggled with it at times. So it was my wife, Kathy, is the one that made it all work. Just truly amazing woman. Mm-hmm. And she's the one that's saying, okay, she's been retired now for about 3 or 4 years, and David, look.
Is it time? Yeah.
It's time, yeah.
Yeah, it's time. What about like music? What music does David Northcott listen
Holy
to?
cow, almost everything I like.
Yeah?
I like the, I really like the Weavers and some of that the stuff from the 50s where some of that early folk music came through, and I love that kind of stuff. I love some of the old blues and stuff from the early part of the last century. I've got a great taste for a lot of, I like the more popular style of classical music, and I've enjoyed that. Oddly, there's every once in a while there's a couple of areas I like from some of the operas that I heard. My sister is an opera singer, so I learned to love and hate that at the same time.
Yeah,
but there's so I'm sort of a spotty person when it comes to music.
Mm-hmm. Was it 2009 that you suffered a heart attack?
Yes.
So
yeah.
I would have to imagine, when that happens to anyone, I mean, that can really change your perspective on life. What did that teach you?
I think it taught me that I'm frail, is that you can't keep a pace, you can't do a 60, 70-hour work week and shoulder burdens and everybody else's burdens without paying the human or spirit or physical price.
Okay.
And that was, like, I'm not a smoker and not a heavy drinker, and so it was stress related, because that's one of the components of a heart attack. I mean, the blessing was, it was a heart attack that was a wake-up call. A friend of mine also had a heart attack and it killed him, and it was very sobering in that time. So since that time I've tried to work more balanced. We've tried to build different structures around Winnipeg Harvest. We got some more management structures rather than just have it all go through one person. So it was a huge learning and wake-up piece for me, and I looked at my kids a lot differently, looked at my wife Kathy a lot differently. Yeah. And then so the pattern then was to start saying, when do I retire on this kind of stuff? Where before I burn. I love you get that spiritual itch in life, and you scratch it, so I just did that and had to pause a bit and say, yes, I still love what I do, but I want to look differently at my spouse and my kids, and my grandkids now. And
that starts by taking care of yourself. Yeah, of course.
You've got to.
Of course.
At that point in time, no one else was in charge of that but me.
David Northcott is here at Smith Restaurant with myself, Mike Valente. This is Up Front on Shaw TV. Let's talk about the distribution at Winnipeg Harvest. It's quite extensive here in the city, but also the entire province. You're sharing food with all of Manitoba. So when we talk about that, how do you break down the numbers?
It's a difficult piece to do because it's a very unique province in Canada where probably 70-75% of the population lives in one urban setting. So we also know there's almost 85% of the food bank activity in Manitoba operates at Winnipeg Harvest. It's not something we like, it's just that's the way it is. So the second largest community, so Winnipeg Harvest would handle about 51,000 people a month in Winnipeg. Mm-hmm. We would be the second largest community in the province, where that group is even bigger than Brandon. Right. So the second group is Brandon, then Selkirk, and there's a number of communities that are smaller communities after that. So the idea would be to have about 10, 11,000 families or people outside the city of Winnipeg that get hampers and food that works by local support. And we oftentimes from Winnipeg Harvest through the Manitoba Association of Food Banks will provide support to rural areas as well. Right. So we're very sensitive that a lot of our food comes from rural sides, that we make sure rural food gets back to communities in those in those areas.
I would have to imagine though the rural areas getting food out there is quite costly. I mean that's got to be a challenge.
Absolutely it is, but because we're the biggest food bank in Manitoba, we need to shoulder that burden. Yeah. And that's a burden we do joyously. We have trucks, we have a lot of infrastructure, we got a lot of volunteers and the key groups of paid people. So we're able to move trucks and negotiate with different companies to be able to get product into different areas. We're dealing with about just over 1.1 million pounds of food a month, for almost 600,000 kilos a month. I mean, that's the scale. And then when we look at Brandon and other food programs, they're much, much smaller. So our sense of responsibility is great, that we make sure we take the burden of making sure we share food with them.
When we talk about how many people in the province you're feeding, do you have a number for that, or?
It's in the 11 to 12,000 people throughout the province, and about 51,000 right in the city. So overall, about 62,000 people in Manitoba eat at a food bank.
Right. Okay, so let's talk about the training programs that you mentioned a few minutes ago.
Sweet.
I want to hear about this, because when you say training programs at Winnipeg Harvest, what does that mean? And who's being trained?
I think the matrix of training, you can't just say, let's cut right here and start training and we'll move you off to life that way and you're done.
All right.
Training means that sense of self-esteem that you start at the very beginning, saying, if you come in and help me out, you are okay. Like, you're not a bad person. You haven't failed your family. You've done everything right, and despite that, you're struggling. So that first part of training is that sense of self-esteem. And by having people come and join us in that journey, right away they feel, okay, I'm important enough to make the next hamper. Harvest likes me. I'm part of the Winnipeg Harvest piece now. I have self-esteem and self-worth. Then you start looking at, we need people that can run forklifts and drive trucks, and we teach people forklift drive. We work with a provincial group that does forklift licensing, and we can work with them and train people to licensing status. It gets people jobs. We also train people in safe food handling courses. Provincial Health certifies them as safe food handlers if we teach them to that level. That helps Winnipeg Harvest and gets people jobs. We're training people on how do you clean, how do you do commercial cleaning in offices and warehousing, and that gets people jobs. So we learned that what do we need to do here, make sure there's training attached to all those pieces, so Winnipeg Harvest gets stronger and the person gets more choices to find work for real money in the community that they come from. And that's worked.
That's worked. Yeah. Excellent, absolutely. You're a very passionate guy, David, and I really respect that. You're always kind of preaching the message that, people should get out in their community and be active.
Absolutely.
And I think that's so important, and I think it really speaks to people, including myself, because, we have one life. I think whatever we decide to do with our lives, we should do it with passion and do it to the best of our ability. So where do you think that passion came from in you?
What a great question. In looking back, I think so. I think it's sort of there passively, and you sort of know there's an itch every once in a while and don't know what to do with it. And it wasn't until sort of early teens that I got involved in various youth programs in the city in Vancouver at the time. I had volunteered at the Caresville Community Center and the Dunbar Community Center and did youth programs there, did sports programs and taught people how to build aircraft, all that kind of energetic stuff. But it was the spirit that I learned from the Christian teaching. I'm not saying that's the hierarchical church, but the Christian teaching that you got to love one another and forgive one another.
Yes.
And I think that was the piece.
Yeah.
And that's what sort of said, well, wait a minute, there has got to be a better way in this, and that put it in motion. And then the other sort of conversation and conversion point was meeting a guy named Bill Lewis, who was a street drunk, self-described street drunk, and he introduced me to Paulo Freire's book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. So moving from loving one another and having the sort of the Christian teaching, which is a narrow, can be large or narrow, but that love one another and forgive one another. Mm-hmm. And then looked at oppression. And for us, and for me, that's what really moved me to the next step, is how do I get involved in the community? I now have a framework to say it's never been about hunger and poverty at Winnipeg Harvest, it's about power. Mm-hmm. So how do we describe that? We did a workshop together to try and change the conversation from, oh my goodness, I'm poor, to say, well, wait a minute, I'm powerful, but let's learn how to be powerful. And where are you? You might not be rich, but you still have influence in the community. And that was the other sort of conversion point.
You've often said your biggest challenge is your biggest goal, and that's ending the food bank.
That's right.
To the point where we don't even need food banks anymore.
That's right.
Do you see that happening in the next, say, 10, 15 years?
Yes.
Like, how do you do see it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think there's an appetite for it. There's some different components. When we first started the food bank movement in Canada, Winnipeg Harvest was one of the founding members of the provincial organization and the founding members of the Canadian Food Banks Association, so Winnipeg Harvest and Toronto Daily Bread. So that movement went forward with the vision that said success for us is closing the food bank in the early days. Remember in the 80s, that's when Ed Broadbent left office, and when he left office, had an all-party motion that was voted on and passed that said they would eliminate child poverty by the year 2000. And it passed 100%. All the MPs voted for it. That was sort of heady days. We said, okay, great. We're doing our part, we'll make sure people, and the province and the feds have jumped on that one, great. Well, there was 934,000 poor kids when Ed Broadbent left office, and by the year 2000, there was 1.3 million poor children. They lied.
Yeah.
So the appetite now is there's a way different collective of people talking and moving this forward. There are medical students that can't be a medical doctor in Manitoba until you spend a day at Winnipeg Harvest and learn about sorting food out and learning out about the justice of it and human rights of it. There's also the same thing attaches to some nursing communities that they can't be graduated as a nurse until you spend a day at the food bank. So we've looked strong to make sure we blend this out to a lot of different communities so that now there's an appetite that says we need to look at the human right of it. We work with the Public Interest Law Center to test out right to food and human rights and adequacy of benefit. That's working. So we're doing all these components to be able to raise consciousness and awareness among powerful and future powerful people. We're looking at raising consciousness and awareness of people that are poor and hungry that have a voice at the table. So the appetite now for change is far more mature and deeply rooted in the community. So I have hope that that will move things forward.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. A few more minutes here with David Northcott, the Executive Director of Winnipeg Harvest, here on Upfront on Shaw TV. When you think back over the years, David, now that you're ramping things up here, June 30th, which is crazy.
It's coming too fast.
I'm sure, yeah. When you look back, though, are there specific things that always pop into your mind, like specific experiences or certain people? Because I'm sure when you leave the doors there, you will say, well, I'm never going to forget that, or I'm never going to forget that person.
Unfortunately, most of them.
Yeah.
They're all such unique and delightful people. Our early days at Winnipeg Harvest, we were in an old building right across the street from a Club St. B in Old St. Boniface, or an old Keebles brewery. No one knew us, no one knew who we were, no one would give us a chance, so our accountant signed for us, and we got a lease from a local small family-owned company. They leased part of the building to us. It was great. And we would get product coming and going, and we struggled for time and people to donate time to us, etc. Then the club owner across the street would shut down the bar when I got a big load of potatoes in. He'd kick all the folks out, go help Northcott, he needs help. And he would shut the bar down and force the guys to come over and give me a hand. It was great. It was great for that hour. And so that harmony of people who are drinkers, and we think they're terrible folks, they had a chance to move it forward. So I love that piece, and it was Franco Magnifico who owned it at the time, and he's the guy that sort of let's let this take place. There was also a couple of strippers that I met in the early days who became remarkable women. They needed a chance. They got actively involved in Harvest. They added to the spirit of the place, the genuine spirit of caring, and they rose above a lot of other issues. And they taught me a lot that has said, you don't need to be me measuring and judging who you are. When you come to the table you want to share with others, you build on that.
Right.
And that worked. That still works to this day. I've also met people who are two Aboriginal women, remarkable women, who have struggled through things that would break me, and yet they come to the table regularly despite their health issues, despite death in their families, despite struggles they've got in their own communities. They come in, and every second day now, they used to be every day, they work hard. And they move food, and they sort the hampers out, and they're really neat women.
Yeah.
And they're inspirational. So and there's so many stories like that despite the fact that you and I have got some opportunities and choices in life, here's people with far less choices in life, come to the table and are helping others.
Yeah.
They deserve a seat at the same table I'm at. I'm delighted to let me stay with them.
So June 30th is your last day.
Yeah.
So first week of July, are you going to be able to sit there and say to yourself, this is what I'm most proud of? Are you going to be able to define that or determine that?
No, it's too hard to do that.
Yeah.
I think that first week in July we'll say there's a lot of unfinished business. There's a lot of pieces that I see the food bank and the team there is taking on now and is shouldering. I'm delighted at that. And I think that's the part that I can rest from, is that I don't have to shoulder all the burdens myself anymore, but I know there's others taking it on and moving it forward in the right way. The other piece is I want to reconnect more strongly with my wife and my kids and my grandkids.
Sure. Yeah.
And I've not put in all the time into that family.
Until it's coming up, right?
I haven't put the right time in that family. It's time to pay back.
Well, you've also helped a lot of people in this city and in this province, David. Just in this half an hour conversation, it really speaks to your character, how inspirational you are, and how much work you've done. So I really appreciate the time.
Well, it's very kind of you. Thank you
very
very
much, David.
And volunteer your time at Harvest.
Absolutely, yes. Let's go now.
Away we go.
You've been watching Upfront on Shaw TV. We've been chatting with the Executive Director of Winnipeg Harvest, David Northcott. Thanks very much for watching.